Snow pressed against the tall windows of Langford Manor as though winter itself wished to attend the festivities within. The December house party had drawn half the county's nobility, each swathed in silk, satin, or carefully polished pride. Candlelight shimmered across gilded cornices and porcelain vases, reflecting a world that pretended at warmth while thriving on quiet cruelty. In such company, every smile was rehearsed, every compliment a transaction, and every misstep remembered far longer than any kindness. Lady Eleanor Harcourt felt each gaze like the prickle of frost upon her skin, though she kept her chin raised with the fragile dignity she had been raised to uphold. She moved through the ballroom with practiced poise, yet the murmur of whispers followed her like a persistent shadow. "The broken engagement," someone breathed behind a feathered fan. "So unfortunate," another replied, her voice a syrupy lament laced with satisfaction. Eleanor pretended not to hear. She focused instead on the string quartet tucked beneath the balcony, their bows gliding as though unaware of the undercurrents swirling among the guests. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, for her corset allowed only the smallest indulgence in air, and panic would show far too quickly. Her mother's hand had squeezed her arm just moments earlier, an unspoken command to smile, to pretend that humiliation did not cling to her like soot. But shame was not easily masked. Rumors had spread with merciless speed once the engagement had been dissolved. Her former suitor, Lieutenant James Barrett, had been charming in the beginning, handsome, eloquent, the sort of man who turned heads when he entered a room. Yet charm had proved a fragile shield against debts amassed through reckless gambling. When the truth emerged, Eleanor had broken the promise she once believed would secure her future. She had done so quietly, privately, with a letter drafted in careful, aching lines. But Barrett had not accepted her decision with grace. He appeared now near the refreshment table, his uniform pressed but frayed at the cuffs, dark hair slicked back as though he hoped polished appearance might conceal the cracks beneath. Eleanor's breath caught. She prayed he would ignore her, remain drinking away whatever pride he still possessed. But he lifted his gaze and found her instantly, as though her presence was a thread he had never stopped holding. He crossed the room with purpose. Guests stepped aside subtly, not enough to be rude, but enough to ensure they were uninvolved. Eleanor forced her shoulders steady, though her pulse lurched. Barrett stopped before her, his voice low and urgent. "We need to speak," he said. "There is nothing left to discuss," she replied, her tone composed though her chest tightened. "Oh, but there is," he insisted, leaning closer. "You owe me the courtesy of explanation. You owe me far more than silence." "I owe you nothing." She kept her voice measured, willing her expression to remain placid. The Dowager Countess beside them pretended to admire a centerpiece, but watched keenly from the corner of her eye. Barrett's jaw flexed. "You are ruining me." "You ruined yourself," she whispered. He inhaled sharply, fury and desperation tangling in his gaze. "You cannot simply cast me aside and expect me to fade into nothing. You promised yourself to me." Eleanor felt heat crawl up her neck as several ears tilted subtly in their direction. Barrett stepped closer still, invading the space propriety demanded he honor. She could smell brandy on his breath. "Lieutenant," she murmured, glancing around, "you are drawing attention. Then speak with me privately." "No." His fingers brushed her sleeve, too familiar, too bold. Panic fluttered in her throat. If someone saw him touch her again, if another rumor bloomed, her reputation might suffer beyond repair. Without thinking, she stepped away. Her heel caught slightly on the polished floor, but she maintained balance and slipped toward the corridor. "Eleanor," he hissed behind her, but she did not turn. The hallway was dim, lit by flickering sconces that cast uneven shadows on the stone walls. She walked quickly at first, then faster still as she heard Barrett's footsteps echoing after her. The emptiness of the corridor swallowed sound, making each step feel louder, each breath sharper. She tried the first door. Locked. Her heart jumped. She tried the next. Also locked. Barrett's voice floated down the hallway, sharp, frustrated. "Do not run from me." Fear surged. She reached the third door, seized the handle, and pushed. It opened with a soft groan. She slipped inside, closed it swiftly behind her, and pressed her back against the wood. Her breath trembled in her throat. She steadied herself, eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the hearth. Then she froze. The room was not empty. A tall figure sat near the fire, Kane leaning against the arm of his chair, posture straight but shadowed by the flame's low flicker. His hair was dark, his jaw strong, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, held a weariness that spoke of battles neither polite society nor whispered gossip could imagine. The Duke of Ravensbury. She had heard his name murmured in the ballroom earlier, spoken with a mix of awe and curiosity. A reclusive war hero, recently returned from the peninsula. A man rarely seen and even more rarely engaged in conversation. Yet here he sat, unexpectedly, impossibly present in the chamber she had fled into. "Forgive me," she breathed, mortification flooding her. I did not realize." Before she could finish, the door behind her rattled. Barrett's hand had found the handle. Eleanor's pulse thundered as the latch clicked. She stepped aside instinctively just as the door flew open. Barrett stormed in, eyes wild with indignation, only to halt at the sight of the Duke rising slowly from his chair. The air collapsed into silence. The Duke's gaze moved from Eleanor to Barrett with cool, unhurried clarity. He reached for his cane, not with weakness, but with deliberate authority. "Sir," he said, his voice calm enough to chill the room, "you seem to have mistaken this lady's wishes." Barrett stiffened. "Your Grace, I was merely—" "And," the Duke continued, his tone sharpening like a blade sheathed in frost, "you are standing in my chamber." Eleanor felt something inside her shift, fear loosening, hope stirring, the world narrowing into this charged, impossible moment. Barrett faltered, swallowed, and stepped back. But the Duke did not look away. And Eleanor, breath tight and trembling, realized her life had just veered into territory from which there would be no graceful return. A beat of stillness lingered in the chamber, thin as ice over deep water, before Lieutenant Barrett recovered enough pride to attempt civility. His gaze flicked between Eleanor and the Duke, each glance sharp with accusation, as though he believed the room itself conspired against him. "Your Grace," he began, forcing stiffness into his voice, "I assure you, this is all a misunderstanding. Lady Eleanor and I—" The Duke lifted one hand, a subtle motion, yet imbued with such authority that Barrett's words withered mid-sentence. "I am not inclined to tolerate falsehoods tonight," he said quietly. His eyes, a deep, unreadable gray, remained fixed upon Barrett with the measured steadiness of a man accustomed to command. "If Lady Eleanor wished to speak with you, she would not be fleeing down a corridor." Eleanor felt heat rise beneath her skin. Gratitude warred with embarrassment, for though the Duke spoke truth, hearing it aloud made her painfully aware of how undignified her escape must have seemed. She clasped her hands before her, careful to keep them still, though her pulse throbbed fiercely. Barrett's jaw flexed again, anger sparking beneath his strained composure. "I mean her no harm," he insisted, stepping toward her. "We were once promised, after all. I seek only to resolve our—" "You will go," the Duke interrupted, his voice unyielding. "Now." Barrett hesitated. His pride fought visibly against prudence, but even in his frustration, he knew he could not challenge a Duke, least of all one with a record forged on battlefields where men either followed orders or died. Barrett turned at last, stiff with humiliation, and exited the room without daring further protest. The door closed behind him, sealing the chamber once more in a wash of dim firelight and uneasy quiet. Eleanor released a breath she scarcely realized she had been holding. She kept her gaze lowered for a moment, gathering her composure. "Your Grace," she murmured, "I am deeply sorry for intruding. I assure you, I had no intention of disturbing your peace." The Duke studied her, not with impropriety, but with a keen, searching awareness, as though he observed not merely her posture or expression but the strain beneath them. "There is no need to apologize," he replied. "You were frightened. That is reason enough." "I should not have run," she said quietly. "On the contrary," he countered, "running was the only sensible choice." His tone was calm, yet edged with a dry certainty that drew her eyes to his. A cornered woman gains nothing from standing still. She almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she dipped her head in acknowledgment, though her thoughts churned with shame. To be pursued through a nobleman's corridors like a careless debutante was mortifying. To be found hiding in a man's bedchamber, a duke's no less, could fuel enough gossip to scorch her reputation beyond recognition. The duke seemed to register the flicker of dread in her expression. "You are safe here," he said, his voice softer now. "And nothing improper will occur as a result of your escape." "I will see to that." Eleanor hesitated, then dared to ask, "Even if someone saw me enter?" His brow creased slightly, acknowledging the danger without flinching from it. "I will manage whatever consequence arises. A man in my position can silence most misunderstandings. Most, but not all." The unspoken truth hung between them. The Duke could protect her from slander, but not from the whispers that thrived on imagination more than fact. Still, his assurance steadied her, warming the cold fear that had settled in her chest. He gestured gently toward the chair opposite his own. "Please, sit a moment. You are trembling." She had not realized she was. She moved cautiously, taking the offered seat with the grace expected of a noblewoman, though her breath remained thin. The Duke resumed his chair, leaning his cane against his knee. She noticed how he shifted slightly, withdrawing pressure from his injured leg. He caught her glance, but instead of withdrawing, he met it directly. "The injury?" she asked, and instantly regretted the boldness. "Forgive me. I should not inquire." "Most people do," he answered. "Few have the courtesy to apologize." His tone held no resentment, only observation. "A musket ball. Salamanca. The surgeons did what they could." Eleanor absorbed his words with quiet reverence. The Duke's reputation as a war hero had woven its way through society for months, often embellished with tales both admiring and morbid. Yet hearing the truth spoken so plainly by the man himself lent it a weight she had not expected. "I am sorry," she said, "for what you endured." "I survived," he replied simply. "Many did not. That is the only part worth grieving." His restraint, his refusal to center himself in his own suffering, deepened her respect for him. The ballroom's whispers had painted him as aloof, distant, a man who preferred solitude. But she sensed now that solitude was not preference but consequence, the sort born of wounds deeper than flesh. The fire crackled softly, casting fleeting gold along his features. She found herself acutely aware of the strange intimacy of the moment. She had never spoken with him before tonight, yet here she sat in a private chamber, sharing quiet confessions that would have startled any chaperone into fainting. "Lady Eleanor," he said gently, "why does Lieutenant Barrett pursue you with such desperation?" She stiffened, but the sincerity in his expression coaxed honesty from her. "We were engaged," she admitted. "It was expected. Our families approved, and he was charming at first. But debts, rumors, and temper soon revealed themselves." Her fingers tightened on her skirt. "Ending the engagement was necessary. But he believes he can persuade me otherwise." "Persuasion is a poor word for what I witnessed," the Duke said. "That was coercion." Her throat tightened. To hear someone of his standing acknowledge it felt like vindication she had not known she craved. Society often fails to distinguish the two. "Then society is blind," he murmured. Silence followed, gentle, contemplative, but threaded with something warmer, something hesitant. Eleanor sensed he wished to say more, but he stopped himself, maintaining the barrier demanded by propriety. At length, he stood with deliberate care and moved toward the door. "I will escort you back to the gathering. If anyone asks, you sought out a quiet room for air, and I happened upon you on my return from solitude." She rose slowly. "You would do that for me?" "I would do much more," he said almost absently. Then he caught himself, refining his tone. "It is the honorable course." Heat fluttered beneath her ribs, surprise, gratitude, and a bewildering awareness she dared not name. He opened the door and extended his arm, formal and steady. Eleanor placed her hand upon it, feeling the restrained strength beneath the fabric of his coat. They stepped into the corridor, moving with composed precision, as though nothing had transpired behind the closed door. But each footstep felt different, changed, rooted in the knowledge that fate had placed their paths far closer than society would ever deem appropriate. And yet, as they approached the distant swell of violins and murmuring voices, Eleanor realized she dreaded returning to a world that suddenly felt too shallow, too bright, too loud. The Duke slowed slightly, sensing her hesitation without needing words. "Courage," he murmured. "We face them together." The promise in that single phrase, quiet, steady, unmistakable, settled over her like the first warm breath after a winter storm. Eleanor hardly remembered the music, the faces, or the glittering chandeliers that greeted her upon her return to the ballroom. All she truly perceived was the Duke beside her, the slight but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere as guests noticed their entrance together, and the quiet certainty in the way he guided her forward. Conversation dipped, rose again, then dipped once more, like a tide struggling against its own pull. The Duke seemed not to notice, or perhaps he merely refused to grant attention to gossip that had not yet found its courage. He released her arm only when they reached a pocket of calm near the tall windows, where candlelight dimmed enough to offer a measure of privacy. "You handled yourself with admirable composure," he murmured. His gaze remained on the room rather than on her, as though he sought to shield her even from the weight of his own admiration. "I felt anything but composed," she admitted. "But your presence steadied me." His lips curved, not quite a smile, not quite solemnity, but something in between. "You give me too much credit." "On the contrary," she said softly, "I do not give you enough." His hand tightened slightly on the head of his cane, an unconscious gesture that betrayed more emotion than any expression might. She wondered, just for a breath, whether he struggled to maintain his distance, as she struggled to maintain hers. But he turned away before she could decipher the truth, nodding politely to a passing couple who greeted him with excessive enthusiasm. The Duke inclined his head in return, but his eyes flicked back to Eleanor the moment they were gone, as though tethered to her by some unseen thread. Before she could speak, a footman approached with hesitant urgency. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor, the Marchioness of Harcourt requests her daughter's presence." "Immediately." Eleanor's breath caught. "My mother? Why?" The footman bowed. "She did not confide in me, my lady. She waits in the antechamber." The Duke's expression shifted, still controlled, yet sharpened with concern. "You need not face this alone. My mother will not wish to see you," she said sadly. "Not in connection with anything that may be whispered tonight." "I am accustomed to being unwelcome," he responded with quiet humor. "But I am not accustomed to abandoning someone who may require protection." Her chest tightened. Still, she shook her head. "Let me speak with her first. If I need your presence, I will send for you." He hesitated, the conflict clear in his eyes. Then, reluctantly, he bowed. "I will remain nearby. Should anything trouble you, even a whisper, call for me without delay." She thanked him with a look rather than words, then followed the footman out of the ballroom. The antechamber lay dim and cool, lit by only a few scattered candles. Her mother stood near the mantel, posture rigid, hands clasped tightly before her. At the sight of Eleanor, she exhaled sharply. "Child," her mother said, "is it true? Were you seen entering the Duke's private chamber?" Eleanor's pulse stumbled. It was not as it appeared. "So it did happen." The Marchioness pressed a hand to her forehead. "Eleanor, the danger of such impropriety." "Mother," she interrupted gently, "I was fleeing Lieutenant Barrett. He cornered me." The older woman's eyes softened for a brief, fragile moment. "I worry for you," she whispered. "But even so, your reputation hangs by a thread." Eleanor swallowed, unable to disagree. "The Duke helped me. He protected me." Her mother stiffened again. "A man of his rank cannot be entangled in scandal without consequence. If your actions cast suspicion upon him, it may ruin what remains of his standing. You must distance yourself." "Is that truly what you believe?" Eleanor asked. "It is what society will expect. And expectation, my dear, is a force far stronger than truth." Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle over her like a winter cloak. Her mother reached for her hand briefly, then released it as though fearful of holding on too tightly. "Come. We must return before anyone questions our absence." But Eleanor did not move. A clear, steady thought formed within her, one she had not dared entertain until this moment. "Mother," she said, "I must decide my own future. If gossip rises, I will face it. If the Duke's name is drawn into rumor, I will address that too." The Marchioness stared at her, surprised by the quiet defiance in her voice. Yet, before she could respond, the door to the antechamber opened once more. The Duke stood there. He had not waited for a summons. He had come because he sensed, correctly, that Eleanor's courage had reached its limits, and that the next word spoken might determine the course of her life. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone firm yet gentle, "I apologize for intruding, but I cannot allow decisions to be made on my behalf in my absence." Her mother's spine snapped straight. "Your Grace, this is most irregular." "Much in my life is irregular," he replied. "I have no intention of stepping aside while Lady Eleanor is blamed for a circumstance in which she bore no fault." The Marchioness blinked, taken aback by his conviction. Eleanor found her breath again. "Your Grace, what are you saying?" "I am saying," he continued, advancing with measured steps, "that your reputation will not be left to the mercy of whispers. Nor will mine. If our names are to be spoken together tonight, let it be by our choosing." Her heart thudded with painful clarity. "And what choice do you propose?" He paused before her, lowering his voice. "Let me court you, openly, honorably, without pretense." The world contracted, leaving only the rise and fall of her breath and the steady certainty in his gaze. Behind her, her mother gasped softly, but did not intervene. Eleanor's voice trembled, but her resolve did not. "You would risk scandal to protect me?" "I would risk far more," he said. "But I would prefer to begin with that." Her mother's hand fluttered to her chest. Her expression shifted from shock to dawning acceptance. The Duke's sincerity, so simple, so unadorned, left no room for refusal. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Then I accept," she whispered. "Not out of necessity, but out of choice." The Duke's exhale was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she sensed its relief. "Then we stand together," he murmured. And for the first time that night, Eleanor felt not fear, not shame, but the fragile, luminous beginning of hope.